Hello and welcome to Euractiv's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Evi Chiori, and as we close the chapter on 2023, we find ourselves reflecting on a year that has left a lasting mark on both the European Union and the world. In this special year-end episode, we'll take a closer look at the key topics that shaped our coverage throughout the past 12 months. "2023 bids us farewell, and without a doubt it has been a year of profound impact, not only for the European Union and its policies, but for the entire globe. The ongoing war in Ukraine continued to command our attention in 2023, underscoring the geopolitical tensions that persist in the region. But this year, a new war emerged in Gaza, further highlighting the complex challenges faced by the international community. The EU remained committed to supporting Ukraine, opening accession talks and advancing its enlargement policy. A notable shift occurred as more member countries elected right-wing governments, sparking discussions on evolving dynamics. The year concluded with the introduction of a migration pact, emphasizing collaborative solutions, and beyond Brussels, concerns arose about journalists and politicians falling victim to spyware, prompting the European Commission to advocate for increased regulation to safeguard privacy and security. Russia's war on Ukraine continued to shape global events during 2023 as well, but what were the key events of the year and how will this translate into 2024?
So maybe staying on the positive side, I think hands down the EU decision to start accession talks with Ukraine and also with Moldova has been kind of the main big decision that everything has been working towards this year. I've been traveling back and forth between Brussels and Kiev over the past year, and besides really the issue of winning the war, this decision was the most anxiously awaited one, not only by policymakers, but especially by Ukrainian citizens that we spoke to.
Alexandra Brzozowski is Euractiv's Global Europe and Defense reporter.
I remember one conversation with Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Stefanishina in her office in Kiev, where she essentially said, that was 2 weeks before the decision was made, that receiving a no is not an option for them. And then she quoted Eminem saying that success is the only opportunity they have. So I think in the creativity and also in the strength of the approach towards the EU side, that has been quite a big thing for the Ukrainians. It was probably also the biggest surprise to all of us reporting on the summit last week, when EU leaders decided really then relatively quickly to give the green light on the decision, managing also to sidestep Hungary, which was threatening to block it. This came really despite the objections of Orban. So he left the room rather than using his veto after being suggested by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that he should take the infamous coffee break. We should not read this decision yet last week as a wartime discount for Kiev in any sense. I think in reality, the country has done a lot of reforms in wartime in a short period of time, maybe even faster than some other candidate countries have done before. So moving forward, I think there is a lot still to do when it comes to the technical side. The European Commission will send a technical team to Kiev soon to map out the future negotiating framework and start the work on preparing the actual accession. But we have to be realistic that I think everybody agrees that this will take years and is not going to be anytime soon. So the more fundamental issue, and I think that's one of the other key events this year, is whether EU leaders will be able to unblock the 50 billion Ukraine facility, so the financial aid package that is meant to keep the country afloat for the next 4 years. The next crucial date for that, after the failure at the summit last week, is the 1st of February next year, when EU leaders will reconvene for an emergency summit and try to push the decision through. I mean, from EU diplomats, we're hearing that this time around, member states are really willing to use a plan B if necessary, agreeing in EU 26 format, and make sure that there is a decision. And then the bigger question for next year will also be whether Western countries will be able to consolidate the support for Kiev. The US decision is still open, whether the US Congress will approve the 60 billion in support to Ukraine. Yeah, and I think that's the major kind of landmarks to look forward to.
What about signs of Ukraine fatigue, Alex?
Well, the Ukrainians are certainly tired, but no, I don't think that there's an overarching fatigue. Of course, the attention span has shifted also partly to the Middle East after Gaza and is expected to shift even more, I think, with the two big elections next year in the EU and the US. But in general, what we see, at least in Europe, I think is relative unity. It's EU 26 against one, mostly. So the big challenge for EU policymakers will be rather looking beyond the EU, looking whether they can get the global south on board when it comes to the Ukraine peace formula, the peace talks, and a potential post-conflict solution.
Now, moving to the battlefield, is there an indication that the resolution of the conflict might be on the horizon?
So although I would like to be more optimistic, I think, in answering this question, but I think we should be relatively realistic about this. So I'm not going to say anytime soon. Ukraine's President Zelensky this week held his year-end press conference, and himself he said that there was no end in sight really anytime soon. But to be fair, even the Ukrainian military and Western military officials say that this is a war for many years, and they are not really ready to answer the question either. So hearing from Ukrainian sources and some colleagues that are currently reporting on the front lines, they also say the situation is relatively stuck. So Ukraine is now on the defensive along the entire front line, even on the left bank of the Dnipro River, where Kiev has been able to make some gains for the last months. But it is likely that this will continue in the next months and weeks, and Ukraine will have to fully concentrate on defense. The whole stretch of the front line is also heavily mined, which makes it very difficult for both sides to move. At the same time, I think we've been also seeing that Ukrainian drones have forced some Russian warships to redeploy in the Black Sea, so that can be seen as one of the smaller successes in the past weeks. So far, the Ukrainians are not desperate and the front lines are holding, but Zelensky has also turned down a request from the military for now to mobilize 500,000 Ukrainians for the army. It would have been a very unpopular proposal. So the bigger question would really be whether the essential support can reach Kiev. And I think since the US decision is still open, we will have to see how that develops in the next few weeks.
And shifting our focus to another prominent theme of the year, the EU's enlargement, what do the developments in this area signify for the future of the European Union?
In 2022, we were speaking largely about this geopolitical shift in the EU's enlargement policy. But it's really this year that I think the bloc has shown that it is actually really serious about it. So there has been quite a few milestones, the historic decisions not only on Ukraine, but also opening talks with Moldova and the conditionally opening with Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as the candidate status for Georgia and the Western Balkans growth plan. So I think that's quite a huge step forward compared to the years before and certainly compared to the previous commission. But the question now is how much buy-in there will be from the candidate countries to actually proceed with the reforms and how much follow-up there will be from the EU side. So I think the latter is actually the more important thing. Some EU officials I've spoken with have voiced concerns that this de facto green light to Ukraine a few months before the parliament elections could give the far right in some EU member states an upwind. So especially when the debate about Ukraine fatigue would be used as a electoral weapon in some sorts. Mm-hmm. But realistically, the idea is that it will be really the new commission that will have to look at the situation with a fresh pair of eyes. Until then, the candidates actually get some grace period to speed up reforms and align even further. So it's not necessarily negative to wait for the next commission. I think it's a good chance for them to prepare and, consolidate until the next enlargement report comes out and then come maybe with a stronger offer from their side as well. So it's really on the next commission, and then the composition is relatively unclear yet. So we will have to see who takes the commissioner's job, who takes over which institution, and then how that is translated into stronger enlargement policy.
A recurring trend this year was the rise of right-wing and conservative governments in several countries. So which countries witnessed this shift towards conservatism, and has this trend been building up over the past years?
Well, the big one was the Netherlands in November, where we saw Geert Wilders' Freedom Party uh, surprisingly top the poll, largely on the back of an anti-migration election campaign. And I think that they are now still, they're still in talks with other parties on whether they will form a government coalition for the first time.
Benjamin Fox is the editor of Euractiv's Politics Hub.
That's the biggest shift in terms of a core, I guess, a country in old Europe. A far right party wins the election for the first time. But then Finland and Greece also saw victories for conservative parties. But then at the same time, we had Poland bucking the trend. In September, Donald Tusk's centrist coalition and very pro-European coalition took power from the Nationalist Law and Justice Party. I think that was a significant positive result, certainly in terms of EU relations. And Spain as well. There was a dead heat between the Conservatives and Socialists. The Socialists stay in power, so it's quite a nuanced picture. It's not. I don't think we can just say that Conservatives are winning and far right parties are winning everywhere. But certainly the Netherlands was the big shock. This has been a general trend over the last 10 years, actually, that we started to see far right and nationalist parties starting to win elections. Obviously last year, Giorgia Meloni winning in Italy was a big shift. But then at the same time, Marine Le Pen's Front National has been, the second party in France now for, I guess, about a decade. It's been but obviously there are the European elections next June. So this kind of narrative of the rise of the far right and of nationalism, and also the potential threat that it poses to European integration. It's very much at the forefront of people's minds in Brussels.
This coming year, 2024, we will also have the European elections. So will this be a trend that we will see there as well?
I think we will certainly see far-right nationalist parties taking more seats than they did in 2019 and 2014, for example. I think the fact is that in Italy, Brothers of Italy are going to perform very well. Marine Le Pen's party will probably, at the moment they look like they will top the poll in France. We have Wilders in the Netherlands, for example. So we're clearly going to see a fairly substantial block of seats from these parties. Whether or not they come together after the elections and form one political group, which would make them much more powerful in the EU institutions, is another question. They've never managed to do it in the past. They won't have enough to challenge the kind of centrist majority. There will still be a majority, the socialists, the centre-right European People's Party, and the Liberals will, and the Greens. They'll still account for well over 60% of the seats.
And Ben, while mentioning migration, it's important to know that just before the Christmas break, on December 20th, the Member States and the European Parliament struck a deal to reform the bloc's migration policy, capping off a 3-year-long ambitious effort. The agreement is preliminary and still needs to undergo formal ratification, and its laws, known as the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, were first unveiled in September 2020 in an attempt to turn the page on decades of ad hoc crisis management, which saw governments take unilateral and uncoordinated measures to cope with the steep rise in asylum seekers. At its core, the new pact is meant to establish predictable, clear-cut norms that bind all member states, regardless of their geographic location and economic weight. The ultimate goal is to find a balance between the responsibility of frontline nations like Italy, Greece, and Spain, which receive the bulk of asylum seekers, and the principle of solidarity that other countries should uphold. And what is your take on this?
It fits in with this trend towards much stricter border controls. The pact, it's not going to change a huge amount, but the fact is that politicians so EU leaders were desperate to get this package of legislation finished before the European elections. And a large part of that is just that they want to show voters that they've actually done something. There's not actually, in my opinion, that much substance in the pact in terms of there's not a huge amount that will change to the existing European regime on immigration and asylum. But politicians wanted to make sure that they were seen to be doing something. So it's that plus this trend towards kind of cash for migrant control deals with third countries like Tunisia, like Morocco, and we're expecting the announcement of a deal with Egypt in January, where the EU is basically outsourcing border control to North African states. It all fits in with this narrative of keeping people out and keeping Europe's borders much more tightly controlled than we've seen in the past. I think that kind of policy narrative is here to stay for the foreseeable future now.
And migration is one of the reasons why countries are leaning towards more conservative options. But I've been asking this year, is indeed Europe becoming more conservative?
I don't think that Europe is necessarily becoming more conservative. I do think it's a bit more nuanced. I think it is about different policies. On migration, yes, there is this shift toward the kind of a more socially conservative approach to migration and to kind of keeping people out of Europe. But on the economy and jobs, for example, there is much more kind of state support for parties that are offering state intervention than in the past, and I think we're kind of seeing more electorates that are more socially conservative, but at the same time want much more state intervention and management of the economy than we would see from traditional conservative parties, and that's where this niche for kind of populist parties on such as Giorgia Meloni, such as Viktor Orban and Marine Le Pen, that's kind of what they're offering. So it poses a real challenge to not just to the centre-left parties, but also traditional conservative parties as well.
On another front, spyware dominated headlines in 2023, especially in Greece, where journalists faced wiretapping, raising concerns about media freedom and the illicit use of spyware. So, what were the main developments in this saga?
Spyware was a topic I was lucky enough to cover a few times this year, and you're right, it kind of kept popping up. The first time I covered it, I think, was when I was writing about Pegasus being banned in Catalonia in April.
Julia Tar is Euractiv's technology reporter.
And then in June, I looked more into how Cyprus has become the entry point for Israeli cybersecurity companies, including those in the world of surveillance software. And there was definitely many links to Greece there, but I think when talking about a Greek angle, it might be more important to mention that at the end of July, the Greek Data Protection Authority reported that 92 Greeks, including politicians, ministers, and journalists, have received infected SMS associated with the Predator spyware. And this is not only important on a national level, but also on the EU level, because if you're under surveillance, then you can also be spied on when talking to other European ministers, for example.
Indeed, Julia, Nikos Androulakis, an EU lawmaker at the time and head of the Greek Socialist Party PASOK, found out his phone had been bugged during a check that was conducted by the European Parliament on his phone. So what action was taken by the Commission, and where are we standing now on this front?
I think that's an interesting question, because the Commission always emphasized that this is a matter for the national authorities. But someone who is very critical of this answer from the Parliament side is Sophie in 't Veld. She's the MEP who has been spearheading the works of the Pegasus investigation in the PEGA committee. And she repeatedly said that the Commission should enforce the EU law.
And in October, Euractiv's Technology Hub reported that a report by Amnesty International found that the European Council and the European Commission are ineffective when it comes to regulating spyware. Could we expect more action on this matter in 2024?
There is a rumor that a spyware regulation might be among the Commission's files next year, but based on what I've heard, I don't think there will be a majority for a ban, or at least not for an EU-wide ban. And Sophie in 't Veld told me a few weeks ago that she thinks the focus should be on under what conditions spyware can be and cannot be used, rather than simply just banning it. And I think the last thing I'd like to add about this is the European Media Freedom Act, or the EMFA, because EU institutions found political agreement on the file on the 15th of December. But perhaps the most controversial part of the topic was a national security exemption, and that would have allowed national authorities to use spyware also against journalists for national security reasons. The criticism about this was that what such a reason might be is up to the member states to define. So I think that was a really interesting part of the EMFA, and but in the end, the reference to national security was removed, and a new wording states that the law respects the EU country's national responsibilities as established in the treaties.
Thank you very much. And that's all for today. If you want to refresh your memory, you can find links to all the episodes of our podcast on the previously discussed matters in this episode's description or in our show notes. I am Evi Chiori, and this was the last episode of the Beyond the Byline podcast for 2023. We will be back in January, but until then, you can visit euractiv.com to stay on top of the latest news. You can sign up to our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever it is that you listen to your podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and enjoy your holidays. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.